The study we chose to replicate was done by Rosenblum et al. In 2019, and it studied the effects of a technology-based self-monitoring intervention on-task, disruptive, and task completion behaviors for adolescents with autism spectrum disorder. Many individuals diagnosed with autism experience challenges in classroom settings. Often these individuals have off-task behaviors and a wide range of other disruptive behaviors that may affect their academic success. Self-monitoring is an evidence-based intervention that addresses these challenging behaviors, and it also promotes independence and self-management skills. It decreases prompt dependency while increasing instructional control and instructional time. According to Rosenblum et al., it shows an overall improvement on the quality of work. The original study evaluated the functional relation between the iConnect self-monitoring intervention and an increase in on-task behaviors, a decrease in disruptive behaviors, and an increase in task completion. In the original study, there were 4 male participants, ages ranging from 10 to 17, and they were all diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. The participants were recruited from a private school that provided services for students with challenging behaviors. All of the participants engaged in off-task behaviors while working in their independent academic work. The study was conducted in a classroom setting, and it was set up to resemble a special needs classroom as well as a general education classroom. The reason they did this was to facilitate generalization skills. Each of the classrooms were assigned to the participants based on their individual needs, and one teacher was assigned for each participant. The materials used in the study included a smartphone device with a downloaded iConnect self-monitoring application. The iConnect self-monitoring application had an "Are you on task?" prompt set at 30-second intervals for all of the participants. The experimental design used in the study was an ABAB single subject withdrawal design. The data was collected about 4 to 5 times a week during the participants' scheduled independent work time. And the observers utilized a timer and collected data after the teacher cued the students to begin to work. The data was collected for a minimum of 8 minutes and 30 seconds and a maximum of 10 minutes. At the end of the session, the permanent products were collected and recorded for task completion. There were 3 dependent variables in the original study. The primary dependent variable was on-task behavior. On-task behavior was defined as the percentage of intervals in which the participants were actively engaged in their academic work. A 10-second momentary time sampling recording was used to measure the percentage in which the on-task behaviors occurred. The secondary dependent variables included the percentage of which disruptive behaviors occurred and the percentage of task completion. Disruptive behaviors were defined as the participant engaging in behaviors that might distract others in a classroom setting, or any behaviors that did not fall in line for the rules of a classroom. The disruptive behaviors were separated into 2 topographies, verbal behavior and motor behavior. These included behaviors such as humming, scripting, and hand flapping. A 10-second partial interval recording was utilized to measure this behavior. The other secondary variable was the percentage of task completion. Each participant was given a task that was individualized to his needs. These tasks included filling out job applications, voter registration forms, and taking notes on current events. For the experimental conditions, the baseline was collected during the participants' independent work time and did not include the iConnect self-monitoring application. The intervention phase started after the baseline data was stable and showed little variability for each participant. This phase included the iConnect self-monitoring application. Following 5 data points and a stable response pattern, the withdrawal phase was implemented. Again, following a minimum of 5 data points and a stable response pattern, the second intervention phase was introduced. 2 weeks after the final intervention phase, the maintenance phase was introduced and completed with 3 data points over 3 consecutive weeks. The data analysis for on-task behaviors are shown on this slide. As you can see, all of the 4 participants, Carl, Stan, Colin, and Jack, showed an increase in on-task behaviors while using the iConnect application during both intervention phases, and these behaviors continued to the maintenance phase. An increase in on-task behavior demonstrated positive findings for the on-task behaviors. On this slide, you can see the data analysis for disruptive behaviors. Each participant has two graphs, one depicting the disruptive verbal behavior, while the other depicts the disruptive motor behavior. As you can see in Stan's graph, during the initial baseline, there was some variability, but the remainder of the study demonstrated low levels of disruptive behaviors with little to no change in responding across phases. Carl was the only participant to show some correlation with decreases in disruptive behavior. Both of his graphs demonstrated some variability in responding, but overall showed a decrease in the disruptive behavior during the intervention phase and the maintenance phase. Jack's disruptive behavior shows high variability in responding and no functional relation to the iConnect self-monitoring intervention. And there's also wanted to note that Colin's graph is not shown on here because during his baseline, he had no disruptive behaviors. Therefore, there was no need for further data collection. This slide shows the data analysis for the task completion. All of the participants' graphs indicate functional relation between the iConnect self-monitoring app and the percentage of task completion. According to Rosenblum et al., an interesting observation was also made during the study. He noted that as the task completion percentages increased, so did the number of assigned tasks. The literature review that we conducted was on two studies. The first study was conducted by Wills and Mason, and they also utilized an iConnect application on a smart device to monitor on-task behaviors. The results of the study showed improvements on on-task behaviors in adolescent males diagnosed with learning disabilities. The second study was conducted by Amada Zek in 2006. This study examined the effects of a motivator device. This device resembled a pager and emitted vibrations to cue children with learning disabilities to monitor their behaviors. The finding in this study suggested that self-monitor devices are effective in increasing on-task behaviors for individuals with learning disabilities.
In our replication study, so the purpose of our replication study was to determine the effectiveness of the iConnect self-monitoring application in decreasing disruptive behavior and increasing on-task behaviors by measuring the number of intervals the participant is on task or engaging in disruptive behavior and the task completion during the session. Increasing on-task behavior should increase academic achievement and task completion. So the research questions that we conducted were similar to that of the original study. The only difference was the population being typically developing graduate students versus adolescents with autism. The primary dependent variable of our study was on-task behavior. On-task behavior was defined as any behavior that the participant was working on for the assignment. This behavior includes reading the assigned textbook for the class. Examples of on-task behavior included reading the assigned Cooper textbook or reading articles that were also assigned for this course. Non-examples would be reading any other ABA material or books that were not part of the course. The study also had two secondary dependent variables, one being disruptive behaviors. Disruptive behaviors were defined as any behavior that takes the participant's attention away from the task. These behaviors included looking at the phone, answering the phone, engaging in interactions with others, talking to someone or playing with pets, or looking away from the assignment for more than 5 seconds. So for example, scrolling through your phone or other applications, watching a TV or movies, grabbing snacks, etc. Non-examples would be transitioning through articles and walking away to grab any materials that are needed to complete the assignment. The other secondary dependent variable, task completion, is defined as the participant reading 5 pages of their assigned textbook or journal article within the 10-minute interval. So the example for this would be participant will read 5 pages in the assigned textbook. Non-example is the participant reading 5 pages of material not related to the course. For the method section, our participants were 5 typically developing graduate students, 3 female and 2 male, with ages ranging from 26 to 45. Our setting was a room in each individual group member's home, which preferably had a desk where you could put all of the course material. Materials for participants in the baseline phase included a timing device that was separate from the recording device, a video recording device, and your textbook or journal article. In the maintenance phase, in the intervention phase, the materials included the same as baseline, but also had a smartphone with the iConnect app set to 30 seconds, and that prompted, "Are you on task?" For the observers, they needed a data collection sheet and a pencil or paper. They also needed an interval timer set to 10 seconds on their smartphone that would signal when the interval was done so that they could collect the data. The experimental design for our study was an AB-AB single subject withdrawal design.
So some of the modifications that we had to make in our study in comparison to the original study included sessions were video recorded and sent to primary observer instead of having an observer present in the session. Each group member was assigned a primary observer, and our sessions were conducted in our homes instead of the classrooms, like the original study had. So data collection and measurements. So we had 10-minute observation sessions were broken down into 10-second intervals. Momentary time sampling was used to measure on-task behaviors. Partial interval recording was used to measure disruptive behaviors, and percentage of task completion was used to measure task completion. Procedures, baseline to and return to baseline. So when each member recording themselves reading 5 pages of class material for a total of 10 minutes, 5 times per week, and we each sent the videos to our primary observer. Members self-reported the amount of pages read, and we trusted that. Primary observer used an interval timer set to 10 seconds to record on task, which is momentary time sampling, and disruptive behavior, included partial interval recording. Number of pages read was divided by a total assigned to obtain % of task completion. So procedure, treatment, and return to treatment. So the procedure is similar to baseline phases. iConnect app was set to 30 seconds and displayed the prompt, "Are you on task?" And then the participant clicked on yes or no. And self-monitoring data was not reviewed. The maintenance phase. This is where 2 weeks following the completion of the second intervention phase, maintenance data was collected to determine the effectiveness of the intervention over a period of time. And 3 maintenance data points were collected for this phase. And data were collected once a week for 3 consecutive weeks. And next, we are going to discuss our results, the results of our study.
So I was Nisbeta's primary observer. I collected her data on task behavior, disruptive behavior, and task completion. As you can see in her data from baseline phase ranged from about 98% on task behavior to 100%. And her disruptive behavior data was only about 10% to some sessions being 0% with disruptive behavior. Because of the stability of her data and the low amount of disruptive behavior and such high on-task behavior, we chose not to move on to the intervention phase for her. And same. Oh. And same. Sorry, I'm still. Can you edit that out? Oh, I watch. Okay. For task completion, she also completed 100% of the tasks, further showing that it was not needed to move on to the intervention phase.
I was the primary observer for Daily Valdez, and this slide shows her data analysis for on-task and disruptive behaviors. As you can see, Daly's on-task showed high levels of on-task responding, indicating no need to continue to the intervention phase. Her on-task baseline had a mean of 98.5 and a range of 98 to 100. Likewise, her disruptive behaviors demonstrated low levels of disruptive behaviors also indicating no further intervention needed. Her disruptive behavior had a mean of 2.8 and a range of 0 to 5. This slide shows Daly's task completion. Her task completion had a mean of 68 and a range of 60 to 70. Although she was not able to complete all of her assigned tasks in the allotted session time during her sessions, her previous graphs indicate that no intervention was needed because she did not show any off-task or disruptive behaviors.
I was the primary observer for Jonathan. And as you can see with the baseline for on-task behavior, it was a mean of 94%. We then went into intervention where he scored 100%, went back to second baseline, which averaged 98%. From that point, we decided that there was no need for a second intervention, and we went into the maintenance phase, which was 100%. For disruptive behavior, it was the same. With the baseline, there was up to a 10% disruption, and then once the intervention, there was 0% for disruptive behavior. Going back to the second baseline, there were only 2 incidents, 2% and 4% for disruptive, meaning that there was no need for a second intervention. And then into maintenance, it shows it was 100%, or 0% for disruptive behavior. For on-task behavior, or task completion, baseline, it was 55% mean for the total study, between 40 and 70% for on-task completion.
Okay, so I was the primary observer for Don's data, and as we see at the beginning, we see a 100% in the first session where Don followed on-task behavior, but near the 5th session, we see a slight decrease down of on-task behavior to 95%. Therefore, it was necessary for intervention to be implemented. So as we see, it was a range in the baseline data from 95% to 100%. During intervention, we see more of a steady state instead of a decline as opposed to baseline 1, where we see 3 of the sessions from session 7, 9, and 10 where data was completed at 100%. And therefore, we moved on to baseline 2, which, as we see, relatively steady with session 14 showing 98% on-task behavior. Therefore, we decided that intervention 2 was not necessary for the next step, where we moved right on to the maintenance phase, and we still see relatively consistent on-task behavior as well, where only 2 of the sessions of 16 and 18 show 100% of on-task behavior. As mentioned before, from his on-task behavior, we're going to talk about his disruptive behavior. So we see a slight increase in 5% for the 5th session. So therefore, as mentioned before, intervention was necessary, and we see more of a steady state during his intervention phase, and which shows more of a steady state back into the baseline phase as well, meaning that intervention 2 was not necessary, meaning we just moved into the next maintenance phase, where there was only 1 session where he had a disruptive behavior where only 1 time it occurred, and it was at 2%. For Don's task completion, we see relatively consistent data where he completed 100% of the time during baseline, 4 out of 5 times. And intervention, we still see relatively consistent data as well, especially near the end for sessions 8, 9, and 10, where task completion was completed at 100%. Therefore, intervention was not needed, as mentioned before. And we moved right into baseline, which then moved into maintenance. And we still see a lot of consistency in that data, where his task completion was at 100% for his last 2 sessions.
I was Antara's primary observer, and as this graph indicates, she had really high percentage of on-task behaviors ranging between 60% and 200%. Therefore, this is just baseline, so intervention was not necessary according to our data. Her task completion shows that she completed 100% of the tasks during the baseline data throughout all 5 sessions. And she only had 1 disruptive behavior in session 1, and then consistently showed 0 disruptive behaviors throughout her the rest of her sessions. So this, all of these graphs show that she did not require an intervention for her behaviors.
All right. So IOA data was collected to see the reliability of the project. So what exactly is IOA data? And IOA stands for Inter-Observer Agreement, in which there's 2 individuals, as we talked about for our results. We have one primary observer that takes all the data from that person and collects it. And then there's also a secondary observer to show for a certain amount of the sessions, but not all the sessions, which I will get into more as the slides go on. But you compare the 2 data of the 2 observers, compare the data, and we'll see the reliability and how it was influenced by the independent variable, which in this case was on the iConnect app. The measurement would have been calculated by the percentage to see how high the percentage was. Therefore, the higher the percentage of the calculation that was conducted, there was more reliable data that was presented. So the study protocol that we used for this, around 30% of our sessions were calculated by the secondary observer. We also used an interval by interval IOA, which I will discuss more in the next slide. And so what is an interval by interval IOA data collection? It's also considered a point by point interval data collection, where there's 2 observers, and then those 2 observers measure on an interval by interval basis. So for the on-task behavior, we used momentary time sampling, and each interval was 10 seconds long. And here we have the formula. It's actually similar to how the total IOA can be collected, where in the numerator we have the number of intervals that the 2 observers agreed upon, and then in the denominator we have a disagreement on intervals plus the agreement on intervals, and then that number is multiplied by 100% to give you the IOA percentage, which I will give an example on this next slide. So we utilized just 1 minute of a session for one of Don's data collections. So as we can see, the X in this table indicates that the participant correctly and was on task during this time. So as we can see, there's an X in each interval box for the primary and secondary observer, meaning that there was 100% IOA agreement between the 2 for that first minute of his session. So here we have the results across, as we can see, relatively and very consistent. The mean was 97% for the on-task behavior as well as the disruptive behavior. There's a little difference in the ranges. There was more accuracy, as you can see, in the on-task behavior across all the participants, from 95% to 100%. And then the range for disruptive behavior dropped from 87% to 100%, but still a relatively high percentage, and still shows the reliability of the data that we collected. And the mean for on-task completion for all participants was at 100%. So the social validity, as we know, it pretty much discusses the acceptability and satisfaction of all the participants involved in the study. We found that that overall satisfaction of the baseline and intervention, especially with the iConnect app, was worked very well, and that it was very useful for staying on task. Especially, as I mentioned before, for the intervention phase, for both Don and I especially, we had pretty much 100% across the board. A couple of things that could change, especially as neurotypically developed individuals, is we could increase the interval time, and also probably the whole session of itself, as like 10. It's tough to maybe get a measurement on just 10 minutes and 10 seconds of interval time. So majority of us had easier time making the 5 pages, but we were thinking about just individualizing the task completion and making it lower for some individuals from the 5 pages, or making it more than 5 pages to see more variability in the data. So, and maybe that can ensure more intervention necessary for all the participants.
In the original study, there are several limitations in the study that should caution the interpretation of results and conclusions being drawn. First, interval length was set at 30 seconds for all participants, making it unclear on the effects of longer intervals. It is difficult to tell if participants needed longer or shorter interval prompts to stay on task. Different individuals have different attention spans and abilities to stay on task, causing a possible need for additional prompting. Individuals with diagnosis of ASD and possible comorbid diagnosis of ADHD have more difficulty with less prompts. Second, accuracy of response to the iConnect application prompt was not evaluated during the study, causing concern for how accurately the participants were tracking their on-task timing. Generalization in terms of setting was also not taken into consideration for this study. Multiple settings intervention with the iConnect would help to provide individuals with ASD to improve self-monitoring skills in any environment. Multiple tasking would also provide generalization for the intervention process of iConnect as well. In addition to addressing the limitations of this study, continued research on the iConnect intervention with adolescents with ASD would provide a way of evaluating the mechanisms of behavior change of self-monitoring, which would be beneficial for the field of ABA. In the current study, there were also several limitations that were encountered. Looking at task completion shows a discrepancy between individuals when completing the task of reading 5 pages. Determining if the amount of task was too high would help to individualize the task in a more appropriate manner, which was pointed out in social validity as well. Extending the period of interval may also affect the amount of disruptive behavior, as well as due to the fact that the longer that you're on task, the more chance for off-task behavior, such as looking around or being interrupted by something in the environment. Interval time of perhaps an hour would be a better indication, especially for graduate students that do not have ASD diagnosis or comorbid diagnosis, for more realistic situations for graduate students. It was also reported that some participants did not feel that they were able to retain the information that they read because they were more focused on just completing the number of pages required. Another limitation of the study was the participants felt that they were more focused on the task at hand because they were aware of the purpose of the study and tried hard to stay on task rather than performing in a more naturalistic environment. Being aware of the need to stay on task may have caused bias in continuing to stay on task by eliminating distractions or realizing that you had to focus more intensely on reading. The effect of having a video recorder focused on the individuals as well caused a more intense focus on staying on task. Having a more naturalistic setting with an observer would have been less intrusive when reading. The intervention phase itself seemed to be distracting in the fact that it caused the individual to pause in order to engage with the iConnect. Taking focus off of reading caused an interference with the flow of studying. Having to pause from reading, look at the iConnect, push on task, and then go back to find where you left off from reading seemed to cause a break that was more of a hindrance than a help at times. This limitation would seem to cause a distraction that would cause difficulty, especially with individuals with disabilities, which was in the original study. Graduate students tend to stay more on task without comorbid diagnosis, such as ADHD. Even with that, there was a level of distraction with the device. In summary, the purpose of this study was to examine the effects of the iConnect intervention on the on-task disruptive and task completion behavior for 4 adolescents with ASD. In the replication study, we examined the effects of iConnect for on-task, disruptive, and task completion behavior for 5 graduate level students. Without appropriate intervention, challenging behaviors such as disruption or getting off task with distractions can often persist and negatively impact educational outcomes. Finding a way to help individuals to stay on task is priority to improve educational results. The iConnect app was utilized to provide a means for students to self-monitor their progress while studying. By having a device to remind you to stay on task can be beneficial to remain on task. In the original study, as well as with the replication study, the iConnect app was very effective and increased on-task behavior during intervention phase. 10-second momentary time sampling recording was used to determine the occurrence or non-occurrence of the target behavior and measure percentage of intervals in which off-task behaviors occurred. 3 of the 5 students in the current study only engaged in the baseline portion of the study due to having a decreased trend line in disruptive behavior, as well as increase on-task behavior in baseline, showing no need for intervention phase since the disruptive phase was not increasing. 2 individuals that went through intervention in the second baseline showed improvement through the intervention phase, as well as in the maintenance and second baseline showed improvement through the intervention phase, as well as in the maintenance phase. Inter-observer agreement involved primary and secondary observer of the primary data. The IOA data for this study was quite high in percentage of agreement between observers with a range of 97 to 100%, showing a strong reliability and validity with the observation process. Overall, the process for replicating the study was quite effective in showing the effectiveness of the iConnect app on improving on-task behavior and reducing disruptive behavior, as well as the observation of the task completed by all individuals. We appreciate you taking time to view our presentation and hope that you enjoyed it. We look forward to any questions that you have regarding our study. Thank you.